The house on Grayfield Lane was never quiet, not really. There were always sounds. The creak of floorboards, the hiss of the kettle, the low murmur of wind finding its way through the gap under the back door that Calloway had promised to fix in the spring of 1817 and never did. But the kind of quiet Willa had learned to live with was a different thing entirely. It was the quiet of being in a room with someone who had stopped seeing you. She had been 23 when she married Calloway Brandt. 23, and her mother had stood at the kitchen window of their small house in Fredericksburg and said, "He is a steady man, Wilhelmina. Steady is what lasts." And Willa had believed her because her mother was not a woman who said things she did not mean. What her mother had not said, what no one had said, was that steady could mean something close to stone, that a man could be faithful and present and utterly, completely absent. It was not a cruel arrangement. She understood that. She had heard of worse. She had a warm house, a pantry that was never empty, a position in the county that meant the women at church greeted her first. Calloway Brandt was respected. He paid his debts on time. He did not drink past a single glass at supper. He had given her 2 miscarriages and a set of silver candlesticks that had belonged to his grandmother. And he spoke of both, with the same measured tone he used for everything else. What he did not give her was any sense that she mattered. Not as a person. Not as a woman who had read every book in her father's library by the time she was 16, who had opinions about crop rotation and poetry and the character of men, who could have run a household twice this size with half the effort. He did not ask her what she thought. He did not tell her what he thought. Not really. He told her what he had decided. There was a difference, and she had spent 6 years learning the full weight of it. She had married him in the autumn of 1816. By the winter of 1818, she had stopped expecting things to change. By 1820, she had stopped expecting things at all. She had made herself small in increments, so gradual she had not noticed until the day she reached for her own reflection in the mirror above the washstand, and felt, for just a moment, that she was reaching for someone she did not quite recognize. The morning it changed was in late October, the kind of October morning that comes to Western Virginia like an apology. All gold light and cold air, the kind of day that should belong to something good. She had been carrying a basket of linens in from the yard when she heard them through the study window. Calloway and his cousin Prentice, and a man she knew only as Fletcher, who ran a mill 2 towns east. She had not meant to stop, she had not meant to listen, but she heard her own name, and the body does not move when it hears its own name spoken in that particular tone. "Wilhelmina is a fine housekeeper," Calloway said. There was the sound of a glass being set down. "I'll grant her that. High praise," Prentice said and laughed. "Well," Calloway's voice carried the easy amusement of a man in his own home, among men he trusted, with no particular reason for care. "She's not what I would have chosen given the choice. But father had debts and her family had land, and that is how these things go." She did not hear what Fletcher said in response. The wind took it. But she heard Prentice. "And does she know that?" "Lord, no," Calloway said. "What would be the point?" The basket was still in her hands. The linens were still white and clean and neatly folded. She stood on the grass outside the study window and felt something happen inside her chest. Not a breaking, exactly, but a settling. The way ice settles when the temperature finally drops past the point of turning back. Something that had been almost solid becoming fully, permanently so. She had wondered, sometimes, in the way women wonder about things they are not supposed to wonder. She had told herself she was being unkind, being uncharitable, reading coldness into what was merely reserve. She had given him every benefit she had. 6 years of benefits. 6 years of making excuses inside her own mind for a man who had been having this conversation with his cousin and his acquaintance, and probably with himself for the entirety of their marriage. Not what I would have chosen. She set the basket down on the grass. She walked back into the house through the kitchen door, and she stood in the middle of the kitchen floor for what felt like a very long time, though the clock on the shelf said it was less than 3 minutes. She looked at the copper pots she had polished every Friday for 6 years. She looked at the calendar on the wall, the one she kept for the household, with every appointment and every market day and every date that mattered to anyone in this house except herself. Then she went upstairs. She did not pack everything. She had learned enough about practicality to know that a woman leaving with a trunk draws attention, and a woman leaving with a traveling bag can still be explained. She took her warmest dress, her second-best boots, the small amount of coin she had saved in a blue pottery jar on the top shelf of her wardrobe, $4.60, accumulated over 2 years of managing the household accounts, and allowing herself, quietly, the smallest of margins. She took the letters from her sister Octavia, who lived in Charleston. She took her mother's ring, which had never been replaced by the ring Calloway gave her, because she had told him her mother's ring fit better and he had not cared enough to argue. She left his ring on the washstand. She set it there deliberately, where he would see it, and she felt something that was not quite satisfaction but was close enough to serve. She did not leave a note. She had thought about it, on the stairs, one hand on the banister. She had tried to think of what she would say. In the end, she could not think of a single sentence that would not be wasted on a man who had just demonstrated, with great clarity, exactly how little her voice had ever meant to him. She went out through the kitchen door again. The basket of linens was still on the grass. She did not pick it up. The road north was one she knew, because she had traveled it with her mother every summer to visit her mother's oldest friend, a woman named Mrs. Galt, who kept a farmhouse near the town of Sutter's Creek, 14 miles up. Willa had walked longer distances than 14 miles. Not recently, not in these boots. But the arithmetic was simple enough. She needed to be far enough from Grayfield Lane before Calloway finished his meeting, and his second glass, and whatever followed, which she estimated was 2 hours at least, possibly 3. She had been walking for 40 minutes when she heard the cart. She did not turn at first, because turning felt like flinching, and she had decided somewhere on that kitchen floor that she was done with flinching. But the cart slowed, and a woman's voice said, "You'll wear through those boots before you reach the crossroads." She turned then. The woman on the cart was perhaps 60, perhaps older, one of those faces that had stopped aging at some point and simply settled into itself. She wore a gray dress and a no-nonsense expression, and she held the reins of a bay mare with the easy grip of someone who had been doing it her whole life. "I'm going to Sutter's Creek," Willa said. "I know where the road goes," the woman said. "I'm going to Millhaven, which is past it. Get up." Her name was Mrs. Starrow. She had been widowed 11 years prior and ran a dry goods operation out of Millhaven with her daughter, and she did not ask Willa any questions that Willa did not want to answer, which was either perception or indifference, and Willa decided it did not matter which. They rode in a silence that was nothing like the silence on Grayfield Lane. It was the silence of two people who had both been somewhere difficult, and were simply for the moment going somewhere else. At the crossroads outside Sutter's Creek, Mrs. Starrow pulled the mare to a stop. "Mrs. Galt still lives on the Sutter's Creek Road," she said, "in case that's where you're headed." Willa looked at her. "I've known Elspeth Galt for 30 years, the older woman said. "She's helped more women than I can count, and she doesn't speak about it afterward, that's all I'll say. She said it the way women say certain things, not as information, but as a key, passed quietly, between hands." Mrs. Galt's house was exactly as Willa remembered it. White clapboard, deep porch, a kitchen garden that ran all the way to the fence line. The old woman herself opened the door before Willa had finished knocking. "Wilhelmina Larch," she said. Willa's maiden name. She had not heard it in 6 years. "Brant," Willa said automatically, and then stopped. Mrs. Galt looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside. I'll put the kettle on." The kitchen smelled like rosemary and wood smoke and something baking, and Willa sat down at the table and felt something she had not felt in so long that she had almost forgotten the word for it. Safe. Not comfortable, not provided for, not accounted for in someone else's ledger. Safe. She told Mrs. Galt most of it. Not all of it. There were parts that still sat too close to the surface to touch, but enough. Mrs. Galt listened in the way very few people listen, which is to say she did not try to solve anything while Willa was still talking. She poured the tea. She refilled it once. When Willa was finished, she sat for a moment with her hands around her own cup. "Your mother's cousin Desmond Larch," she said. "You know he passed." Willa had not known. She said so. "Last January. He had no children and no wife, and your mother was the only family he counted. You'll want to speak to his solicitor in Sutter's Creek, a man named Aldous Graves, who is honest and who knew Desmond well." She paused. "I believe there's land involved. I'm not certain of the details, but I believe there's land." Willa had not cried yet. She had been distantly aware of this all day, the way you are aware of something waiting for you in another room. Now she felt the first edge of it, and she pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. It was the truest thing she had said in years. "No," Mrs. Galt agreed. "You don't, that's all right. You knew enough to get here." She stayed that night in the small room off the kitchen that Mrs. Galt kept for guests, under a quilt that smelled like cedar and lavender, and she slept in a way she had not slept in years. Not deeply, not soundly, but honestly, which was something different. In the morning, she walked to the office of Aldous Graves, solicitor, on the main street of Sutter's Creek, and she gave her name, and she sat in the chair across from a small, precise man with ink-stained fingers, who looked at her with the careful attention of someone accustomed to people arriving with complicated situations. "Miss Larch," he began, and then looked at the ring on her right hand, her mother's ring, now moved from habit, and corrected himself. "Mrs. Brant, Miss Larch will do," she said. It came out more firmly than she had intended. She did not apologize for it. He had a folder on his desk with her cousin Desmond's name on it. He opened it in the deliberate way of a man who respects documents, which is to say he treated each page as if it contained something worth handling carefully. Desmond Larch had died owning 38 acres of farmland in the valley west of Sutter's Creek, a small house in adequate repair, 2 outbuildings, and the contents of a savings account at the First County Bank that amounted to $212. His will, witnessed and filed 8 months before his death, left the entirety of his estate to his cousin's eldest daughter, Wilhelmina Larch, in trust for her own use and not for any husband's. That last phrase. Desmond had known something, or suspected something, or perhaps he had simply known enough about the world to understand that a woman needed a thing that was irrefutably hers. Willa read the phrase 3 times. "He amended the will in February of last year," Mr. Graves said. "After your mother wrote to him, I believe." Her mother who had died in the spring. Her mother who had stood at a kitchen window and said steady is what lasts, and had also, apparently, written a letter to an old cousin and asked him to do something to make sure her daughter would not be entirely without recourse. "I didn't know she wrote to him," Willa said. "No," Mr. Graves said. He said it gently. "I don't suppose she told you." She did not cry in his office. She waited until she was outside, on the wooden sidewalk, with the October light falling at that late morning angle that turns everything gold and a little unreal, and then she stood there for a moment with one hand pressed to her sternum and let herself feel the full weight of what her mother had done. What her mother had tried, in her quiet, careful way, to leave behind for her. The land was in the valley. She walked there that afternoon with a hand-drawn map from Mr. Graves and her traveling bag over one arm. It was not a large piece of land, not grand, not the kind of thing that would impress Callaway Brant or any man of his acquaintance. But it was real. It was hers. She stood at the fence line and looked at the fields. Fallow now, the grass gone pale and dry in the October cold, and at the small house with its front porch and its 2 windows facing east, and she felt something so unfamiliar it took her a moment to name it. Not safety, not relief, something bigger. She felt the future, her own particular future, that had nothing to do with Grayfield Lane or Callaway Brant or a life built around someone else's decisions. She felt it like a door she had not known existed until someone opened it from the other side. There was a woman named Mrs. Patton who lived on the neighboring property, a practical woman of perhaps 50, who came to introduce herself the next morning with a jar of apple preserves and the direct manner of someone who had decided to be useful rather than delicate about a situation. "You'll need someone to help you get the house in order," Mrs. Patton said. "I have 2 daughters who need work. They're good workers." "I don't have much money," Willa said honestly. "You have $200 and 38 acres," Mrs. Patton said. "That's more than most women start with." She said it not unkindly, and not as flattery. She said it the way women sometimes tell each other the truth, plainly, without decoration, with a respect in it that felt like being handed something solid. Willa hired her daughters. Their names were Bess and Fern, and they were 17 and 19, and they worked with the focused energy of people who know that work means something real. Together, the 4 of them spent the first 2 weeks making the house habitable, cleaning, repairing, understanding what the land could give them in the coming year. Willa wrote everything down in a small notebook she bought at the general store. Everything she spent, everything she planned, every calculation she made about what the land could yield, what it would require, what it might be worth in 5 years if managed with care. She had spent 6 years managing Callaway Brant's household, doing the accounts he did not want to bother with, tracking every expenditure with a precision he had never once acknowledged. She had been doing the same work here, in her own mind, for years. She had just never been allowed to do it for herself. Mr. Graves sent word in the 3rd week that there had been a communication from Callaway Brant, who had apparently found the solicitor through her mother's letters and wished to know his wife's whereabouts. Mr. Graves had replied, on Willa's instruction, that her location was her own business, that the property had been left to her and was legally hers, and that Mr. Brant's recourse, if he believed he had any, would need to proceed through the appropriate legal channels. He also noted, without being asked, that Virginia law in such matters was complicated. but that the specific wording of Desmond Larch's will, for her own use and not for Annie's husband's, had been written by a man who understood that wording mattered. She heard nothing further from Calloway Brant. She did not know what that silence meant, and for a time she thought about it more than she wanted to. The thinking was not grief, exactly. It was something more like the adjustment a person makes when a sound they've grown so used to, they no longer notice it simply stops. You have to learn the shape of the room without it. Mrs. Galt came to visit in November, on a Tuesday, with a jar of her own apple preserves and a cutting from a climbing rose she'd been propagating for years. "Plant it by the porch post," she said. "It'll come up in the spring." They sat on the porch together in the thin November sun and drank coffee, and Mrs. Galt told her about the women she had helped over the years. Not all of them, not by name, but she told her enough that Willa understood she was not, in any meaningful sense, alone in this, that there had been others, that there would be others, that the road she had walked with a traveling bag and $4.60 was a road that women had been finding, in one form or another. For as long as there had been women and roads and the particular kind of courage that comes not from being unafraid, but from deciding that fear is not a sufficient reason to stay. "What did you do?" Willa asked, "when you didn't know what came next?" Mrs. Galt considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I did the next small thing," she said, "and then the next one. That's all it ever is." Winter came early that year. The valley went white in December, and Willa learned the particular silence of snow, on a property that was entirely her own. Different from every silence she had known before. Different from the silence of Grayfield Lane. Different from the silence of her girlhood room. Different from the silence of lying in a dark bedroom beside a man who was present and absent at once. This silence was not empty. It was full of everything she had not yet done. She planted winter wheat on 6 acres, on the advice of a neighboring farmer named Mr. Aldous, who was 70 and patient, and did not seem to find it strange that a woman was asking him practical questions about soil and yield and timing. She learned things she had not known, and she wrote them down. She corresponded with Octavia in Charleston, who wrote back with a relief that came through in every line, and who sent, tucked into one of her letters, a small amount of money she called a loan, with a flourish of underlines that made clear it was not intended to be paid back. She thought about Calloway sometimes. Less as the winter deepened. Not with anger, exactly. Anger takes energy, and she had decided to spend her energy on things that moved forward. She thought of him the way you think of a place you lived for a long time and then left, with a kind of flat recognition. She had been there. She was no longer there. The place continued to exist presumably, as places do. By February she had worked out, in her small notebook, a 3-year plan for the land. What she would plant, what she would sell, what she needed to repair on the house before another winter. She had gone back to Mr. Graves twice. Once about a question of water rights on the eastern boundary. Once about something she had found in Desmond's papers that suggested there might be a small additional parcel she hadn't known about. There was 4 more acres, slightly south, that had slipped through the initial accounting. Mr. Graves found it satisfying to have gotten her an additional 4 acres, and she let him be satisfied. In March, a woman appeared at her gate on a Tuesday morning. She was perhaps 25, with a child on her hip, and a bruise she had not quite managed to cover. And she stood at the gate with the particular stillness of someone who has walked a long way, and is not sure they have the right to knock. Willa had seen that stillness before. She recognized it. She went down the porch steps and opened the gate herself. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." The woman's name was Phoebe Shand, and she had come from 3 towns east, and she stayed for 2 weeks while Mrs. Galt made some inquiries, and Willa helped her write 3 letters that needed to be written, and together they worked out what came next, which was not a perfect situation, but was a situation, which was more than she'd had when she arrived at that gate. When Phoebe left, she hugged Willa in the tight, wordless way of someone who has run out of adequate language. Willa stood on the porch and watched her go, with Bess and Fern behind her in the doorway, and she kept returning to this, kept trying to name it precisely. She felt, for the first time since she was perhaps 17, like herself. The actual, full, particular person she had been before the world began the long project of making her smaller. She went back inside. Bess had put the kettle on without being asked. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and the bread Fern had put up to rise before dawn. The notebook was on the table, open to February's accounts, which she needed to finish. She sat down, picked up her pen, and did the next small thing. Outside, the valley was turning green. The climbing rose by the porch post had put out its first 2 leaves. She did not know, yet, everything that came next, but she knew this land. She knew this house. She knew the names in the notebook, and the $4.60 that had become something she would not have been able to articulate on that October morning when she walked away from Grayfield Lane. Something that was not fortune, but was freedom, which she was learning, slowly and with great care, were not the same thing, and that freedom was the one worth having. At the top of a clean page she wrote the date, March 14, 1822. Then she wrote 42 acres mine. She closed the notebook and went to see about the rose.